Minions?
Onion. Big onion. Look at that. Woo! To the good onion. Good onion is a heavy onion. This is a 6-pound onion.
To keep combat streamlined regardless of how many enemies I have in the encounter, I divide my enemies into two separate categories. The main antagonists, who have special abilities and can do all the actions laid out in Splice, like this. And their minions, the background characters that serve as the primary way to deal damage to the players. They also serve as great punching bags for the players to feel cool and powerful. For minions are not normal foes. They're the orcs to your fellowship, the stormtroopers to your rebels, a nameless, faceless, amalgamous blob which your heroes can wade into and emerge victorious, cleaving through foes one after another. Now, that's not to say that you can't have minions that do special things. These rules are just meant to serve as a baseline. You could, for instance, have fire devils that have resistance to fire and deal fire damage. Minions are designed with a few things in mind. First of all is simplicity. All minions within a zone attack the same target. In the rules I have an example of this, and you can see that the minions in the same zone as Kudar do melee against him, and all the minions in the adjacent zone do range attack against him. All rolls that minions take are either going to be flat rolls like initiative, or rolls that add the number of minions that are doing that thing to the die roll. So all the minions that are doing the melee attack, you'll do a roll for them, and if they're attacking the same target, you can probably lump in the 2-hit and the damage rolls for both ranged and melee parties. In fact, it's actually written that way. Now, there's a few different ways that you can tone up or tone down the difficulty of fights with minions. At any moment, you can decide that a group of minions can either do a melee or ranged attack. Minions are this amalgamous blob of enemies, right? So it makes sense that they would be able to do this. You'll want to use this power wisely and cautiously, though, because you don't want to optimize the fun out of this mechanic by wailing on your players as much as you possibly can. A similar line of thought holds true for the way minions use damage types. It's assumed that everyone within the group of minions has access to the 3 basic damage types, slashing, piercing, bludgeoning, because they, again, have a wide array of weapons at their disposal, or at least it's assumed that they do. So for simplicity's sake, you generally don't need to keep track of players' vulnerabilities, resistances, or immunities to these 3 damage types when being attacked by minions, because that just adds extra bookkeeping to our plate, and we don't need to know how many of each damage types all of our minions are using. That's just too much bookkeeping for very little yield, and it just plain slows down gameplay. Again, you'll want to take that advice with a bit of grain of salt, because ignoring immunities and resistances takes away a certain level of fun that your players were trying to have with that character, and conversely, ignoring vulnerabilities can take away a certain amount of drama and tension that is available to us by using vulnerabilities. So when you use minions, get a feel for the room. When should you make an encounter tough? When should enemies pull back and not use their range attacks? Or when can we decide that they just don't have access to ranged attacks? When should you make a character feel powerful with the resistances and immunities? And when should you sprinkle in some tension by not ignoring vulnerabilities? When you mix this all together, you get a pretty fun set of rules to run, and a very streamlined set of rules to run. And so far, my players have really been enjoying fighting minions like this, because combat has never been faster for our group. Minions do come with a caveat, though. You don't want to leave any room for bad faith to be generated at the table because your players don't know how minions work. That means you'll want to let them know that minions are one-shot, one-kill with no AC, that the more minions there are, the more dangerous it's going to get because they'll have higher accuracy and output more damage, and you'll want to let them know that it's sort of ambiguous whether they do melee or ranged attacks and how they treat damage modifiers. Zone design. When it comes to designing both enemies and zones, the only advice I can give right now is avoid staleness. Staleness can take a couple of different forms. In the case of zones, try to make 3 or more zones. Move, stand ground, and maneuver all depend on the existence of zones, which means if players don't have a reason to use those actions, their pool of actions gets reduced considerably, and combat just gets reduced to bonk people over the head till they're dead. Now, there may be instances where you're using less than 3 zones in an encounter. For example, your players may be on the top of a parapet, surrounded on either side by guards, and the only way for them to access more zones would be to fight through this wall of guards on either side of them to access other parts of the parapets. Your players may also create zones that you didn't plan for. In that scenario, they could kick guards off the walls, or they themselves might jump off the walls into a hay cart below. If you just have 3 zones, and all 3 zones are just flat terrain, first of all, you're probably not dividing your zones correctly, because you really are supposed to use points of interest as the focal point for a zone. And secondly, you're giving your players no reason to go into a zone other than the fact that it exists. So other than making sure that you have the right quantity of zones, you also want to make sure that most of your zones exist for some reason. Items within your zones or the zones themselves should change the state of combat and engage your players' minds in some way. In this case, change the state of combat could mean literally changing the battlefield, or it could be presenting players with new information as combat unfolds. Let's take a look at my pre-made adventure to see what I mean. In the first room, every zone has a purpose, and has the potential to affect the state of combat in some way. The bandit camp contains mystery items like the water gourd that could help or harm players in their fight. Players could release the camels in this pen, creating chaos and disrupting the bandit rings. The cave entrance creates a choke point that players have to keep open in order to enter or leave the cave. The bandits also take advantage of this narrow space and use it to funnel intruders. Players don't know that the quicksand zone is there, so all they see on their end is an empty zone in the cave, a false safe spot that they may be able to flank the bandits from. And it very well may be if luck or character traits are on their side, but it also could be a deadly trap. The bandit camp and the camel pen present optional things that the players can interact with. The cave entrance and the quicksand zone present challenges that the players will have to pivot around. Okay, yeah, so going down at the bottom where the Desert Storm Spirit encounter is, I have 6 zones. Now, in some instances, 6 zones might be way too much, but in this instance, I believe it works. In this room is a trapped spirit of desert storms and winds, which in all honesty, my players should not be fighting at this low a level, because in any other instance, it would kill them. Certain creatures in my settings, like incorporeal spirits and undead, can't be harmed by physical means. Instead, whatever is binding them to the physical realm and allowing them to influence it must be withheld from them in order to, for lack of a better term, vanquish them. So that means that we have to create clever solutions to allow our players to beat cool things that we don't want to make less cool. This creature is one of earth and air, and given the circumstances of its imprisonment, I deemed that by restricting its access to open air, it would no longer be able to hold enough of a physical form to be any threat to the party. So we put the demon in a pit underground, and 4 tunnels feed wind into the pit, and scattered about the pit are rocks which can plug them up and render the demon unable to attack the players. The players will have to spend their action points to move these rocks, all the while defending their friends from minions and the big bad himself. Now, I wanted to make sure that there was actual tension around moving the rocks, and that it wouldn't be too easy. Initially, I envisioned this room as a circular room, and because of how zones work, it may indeed be a circular room to some people's eye, and that's perfectly fine. But that doesn't always mean that you should design your zones in a circular manner. So in this instance, I have a specific bottleneck within the area where players will always have to bring their rocks before they can get to where they need to go. It makes it so that you can't just immediately go to the zone that you need to bring a rock. So for example, the Hex Tunnel contains the triangle rock at the start. If I were to design it in a circular fashion, I think the original map just didn't have the sand pit in the center. It was a 2x2 square with the cave entrance. So players would just be able to get to the well, I guess Hex Tunnel is probably not a good example here. Let's see. Circle Tunnel has the Hex Rock. There we go. The Circle Tunnel zone has the Hex Rock. So players in the original design, they just, move one zone and then they're there. If I were to lay out the rocks in a manner where they'd have to move twice, that would mean they'd have to move twice for every rock. And that can become tedious and annoying really fast. So you'll notice that I opted for the X because it creates a common place for them to bring their rocks, hence a central point of tension that we can turn it on and off as GMs, meaning like the bad guys can focus on that zone and still have a decent effect on the game without specifically spreading out and being cheesed by the players. But the rocks do not have to be laid out in crisscross fashion, and they can be put, some of them can be put in the places where they need to be. So the square rock is already near the square tunnel. Players just have to take the action to put the rock in. They don't have to move it anywhere. The Hex Rock and the Circle Rock are the only 2 rocks that have to move a really long distance, and that is a suitable amount of tension. I wouldn't want there to be just 1 rock that players would have to move a long distance, and I wouldn't want there to be 3. 1 is too little and 1 is too much. 2 is just right, and the Triangle Rock just has to move 1 zone over. Enemy design. The principles behind enemy design fall into a similar line of thought as zone design. Don't let combat fall flat because moving and attacking are the only things your enemies can do. Keep things dynamic for your players. Let's take a look at the Desert Sylph again. We'll ignore the basic melee attack, and move on to the first special action, which changes zones into quicksand. We already know the value of making zones dynamic, so nothing too new to cover here. The second action allows the Sylph to summon sand minions, but in this case they aren't meant to deal too much damage. Their purpose is twofold. First, we need some interference when the players move rocks. Secondly, the Sylph is immune to all basic physical means of harm. In a world where most traditional RPGs have taught us that you can still whack ghosts with swords, The Sylph's immunities could be a source of incredible frustration for some players. So we need another outlet where melee-based players can feel like they're still affecting the outcome of the fight in some meaningful way. The last action inflicts a status effect. Like terrain types, status effects are a great way to change the state of combat, but instead of affecting zones, they're affecting players directly. The Sylph has one more gimmick up its sleeve, and in this case it also relates to zone design. I wanted to make sure that players were getting positive feedback as they plugged the tunnels with stones. So the Sylph's access to its moveset is tied to how many tunnels are open. For each tunnel that is closed, I describe the Sylph as getting noticeably weaker, and I'd remove its next most powerful action. This video is already getting longer than I'd like it to be, so in a future video we'll build some enemies together. So feel free to leave a comment of some enemy ideas that you'd like to see built, and I'll do a handful of them.